It was late October, the kind of night where the air holds its breath. In the back streets of Jackson, Mississippi, a man named Malcolm Reese was walking home from a shift at the auto shop. His hands were sore, his clothes smelled faintly of oil, and his mind was fixed on one thought, making it back before the streetlights burned out. That sips when he saw them. Two boys, couldn't have been more than 8 and 10, huddled under the flickering neon of a liquor store sign, dirty clothes, hollow eyes. The older one held his arm protectively around the younger, like a shield. "Yes, Boot, all right," Malcolm asked. The older boy's answer was a stare, the kind of stare that told a whole story without a single word, fear, hunger, and a quiet dare to care. That was the moment. The one nobody could have guessed would echo for decades. The moment that would one day stand between Malcolm and a prison cell he was told he'd never leave. Here's the thing about choices. Most people think they happen in slow motion, a weighing of pros and cons, a deliberate decision, but real life doesn't give you that luxury. Sometimes you act before you think, and the act defines everything after. Malcolm didn't have much himself. A one-bedroom apartment, a fridge that rattled louder than it cooled, but he had something the system couldn't measure, a code. He told the boys, "Come on, I ain't got much, but you ain't sleeping out here tonight." That's how it began. A black man with barely enough for himself, taking in 2 white kids, the world had already written off. No applause, no cameras, just a small quiet decision that, unbeknownst to Malcolm, would one day be his salvation. 20 years later, those same boys, now men, would walk into a courtroom and stop the life sentence the state had prepared for Malcolm. But here sits what that moment teaches us. A single act of kindness is not a transaction. It's an investment you may not live to see mature, but when it does, it can be the difference between despair and deliverance. And for Malcolm, deliverance wasn't just about freedom. It was about justice in a system designed to deny it. Now before we get to the day Malcolm's life hung in the balance, we need to go back to understand the man who made that choice, and the world that made him pay for it. Before Malcolm Reese became the man who took in 2 abandoned boys, he was the boy nobody came for. He grew up in the Magnolia Courts, a housing project, where poverty wasn't just common, it was inherited. His mother worked 2 jobs. His father drifted in and out like bad weather, and the sound of police sirens was as familiar as the sound of cicadas at night. By 12, Malcolm had learned 3 things about the world. The system keeps receipts. One bad mark on your record could follow you for life. People believe what they expect. If they expect trouble from you, they'll find it, even if they have to invent it. Your word is your only currency. Lose that, and you lose everything. In the early 90s, the tough-on-crime wave was hitting Mississippi hard. The so-called war on drugs was more than a policy. It was a net, and it caught more young black men than it ever did the actual traffickers. Malcolm, smart enough to see it, stayed on the edges. He worked odd jobs, fixed cars in his uncle's garage, and kept his circle tight. But the net still brushed past him. A traffic stop, here. A mistaken identity, there. Each time he felt it, that unspoken presumption of guilt. Not because of what he did, but because of who he was, where he lived, and the skin he wore. Here's what most people don't see. Systemic injustice isn't always a hammer. Sometimes it's a slow drip. Years of small cuts, false assumptions, and glass ceilings. By the time you notice the water rising, it's already at your neck. Malcolm's decision to take in those boys didn't come from some Hollywood sense of heroism. It came from memory, from knowing exactly what it feels like to sleep with your back against a wall, wondering if anyone even knows you exist. But that choice, it put him in a strange light in his own community. Some neighbors questioned him. Why take in 2 white kids when black kids are struggling too? Others quietly respected it. They saw the bigger picture. But in the wider world it made him visible, and visibility can be dangerous when you're a black man in Mississippi. Because in the South, kindness doesn't always erase suspicion. Sometimes it amplifies it. And in 2015, that visibility would come back, not as gratitude, but as an accusation so heavy it could bury him alive. By the time the boys Ethan and Caleb had been living with Malcolm for a few months, the rhythm of their lives began to settle. Mornings were school runs in Malcolm's old Chevy, afternoons were homework at the kitchen table, evenings were the 3 of them around a wobbly second-hand dining set. But in Jackson, peace is rarely permanent. It was a Friday evening when the knock came. 3 hard raps, not the kind a friend uses. Malcolm opened the door to find Detective Harlan Briggs, a man with the tired eyes of someone who's made a career out of believing the worst in people. "Malcolm Reese?" "Yeah. We need to ask you some questions about a theft over on East Clay Street. Mind if we come in?" Malcolm knew the rule. Never invite trouble into your home. But Ethan was in the kitchen rinsing dishes. Caleb sat at the table drawing. Saying no might have made it worse. A refusal often got translated into guilt. Inside, the detectives asked about a stolen set of tools from the garage where Malcolm sometimes did side work. He hadn't taken them. He knew who might have. A cousin deep in debt, but giving that name meant putting family in the crosshairs of a system that didn't believe in second chances. Here was the fork in the road. Stay silent and risk the suspicion falling squarely on him. Give up his cousin and possibly save himself, but destroy someone else's shot at redemption. He looked at the boys. Ethan's hands were clenched white around the dish towel. Caleb was watching from the corner of his eye, pencil frozen mid-sketch. They were learning something in that moment, not from the detectives, but from him. Malcolm chose silence. He told Briggs, "I ain't got nothing to say about that." The detective's lip curled, the kind of expression that says I'll be back for you, and he would. Not that night, not for the theft, but for something far worse. Here's what that moment teaches us. Injustice often presents itself as a choice between your survival and your integrity. What they don't tell you is whichever you choose, you'll still pay a price. Malcolm paid in suspicion, in a file with his name on it, marked with quiet notes, uncooperative, possible gang ties, keep tabs. That file would sit in a drawer for years, waiting for the day when the right accusation or the wrong one could pull it out into the light. If you ask most people in Jackson what Malcolm Reese was good at, they say fixing cars. And that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Under the hood of an engine, Malcolm didn't just repair metal, he read patterns. He could trace a noise to its source, find the smallest loose bolt that threw off the whole machine. That same instinct applied to people. He could walk into a room and without meaning to, notice what others missed. The way someone avoided eye contact when lying, the subtle lean of a man trying to intimidate, the nervous tap of a foot when someone had something to hide. It wasn't step magic, it was attention. Years of survival had taught him that small signs were the difference between safety and disaster. But his real hidden power wasn't just observation, it was loyalty. Malcolm had a quiet network built over decades, the shop owner who gave him work when no one else would, the retired teacher who once kept him from suspension, the neighbor whose son Malcolm had kept out of a fight. They weren't powerful people in the eyes of the world, but they were anchors, and anchors can hold you steady when the tide turns against you. The first time this network quietly flexed was in 2004. Ethan had been caught skipping school, picked up by a truancy officer who didn't like the idea of a black man raising two white boys. The officer suggested alternative placement, a polite phrase for removing the boys from Malcolm's care. But within 24 hours, the retired teacher, Mrs. Lillian Grant, walked into the school office, sat down across from the principal, and said, "Those boys are safe where they are, safer than they be anywhere else. Don't make me bring this to the board." The case evaporated. No headlines. No confrontation, just a small victory that no one would remember but Malcolm. Here sits the thing. Hidden power rarely looks like power at all, not until the day it flips the outcome. Malcolm's eyes, his loyalty, his anchors, these were seeds. And seeds have a way of breaking through when the ground shakes hardest. But even seeds can be buried. And in 2015, the ground under Malcolm's feet would crack wide open, because when the system came for him, it didn't just threaten his freedom, it threatened the lives he'd built around him. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the world came crashing down. Malcolm was in the middle of replacing a timing belt on an old Ford when he heard the sound. Sirens. Not the distant kind you tune out, the close kind, the kind that stops conversations. Two police cruisers pulled up outside the shop. Officers stepped out, hands resting on holsters. Customers froze. His coworker backed away like the ground itself had turned dangerous. "Malcolm Reese." He wiped his hands on a rag. "Yeah? You stir under arrest for aggravated assault and attempted murder." The words hit harder than the cold steel of the cuffs. No one asked for his side of the story, no one even explained whose life he was supposed to have tried to take. All he knew was this: in the eyes of everyone watching, guilt had already been decided. The humiliation was surgical. They didn't let him wash the grease from his hands. They didn't wait for the customers to leave. They made sure the perp walk happened in full view of neighbors, coworkers, and anyone passing by. At the station, they told him a man named Ray Danner had been beaten within an inch of his life in an alley behind a bar. Witnesses claimed Malcolm was seen leaving the scene. The so-called witnesses, two men who'd known him since childhood, and who both owed favors to Detective Briggs. Malcolm Sipp's public defender warned him, "With your priors, even if they store just arrests and not convictions, they store going to paint you as dangerous. Mississippi State's 3 strikes laws mean you could be looking at life without parole." That's the part most people don't understand. The system doesn't need to prove you guilty beyond doubt. They just need to frame the doubt in the right way, for the right audience. And in a courtroom where the jury doesn't look like you, the frame becomes the picture. For the first time in decades, Malcolm felt something crack inside. Not anger, he said lived with that all his life. Not fear, fear was just a constant hum in the background. It was hopelessness. Because in that moment, sitting in a holding cell, he realized the truth alone was not enough to save him. Here's what that moment teaches us. The most dangerous breakdown isn't the one everyone can see, it's the quiet collapse that happens inside you when you start to believe the system's version of you might be the only one anyone will ever hear. Malcolm was at the breaking point, and from the outside it looked like the end. 3 days into his stay in the county jail, Malcolm had stopped counting the hours. The noise of the place, the clanging doors, the barking orders, the restless coughs, had blended into a low, endless hum he'd folded into himself, conserving what little energy he had left. That stops when the guard called his name. "You got a visitor." He almost didn't set move. But when he stepped into the small glass-walled visiting room, the air shifted. Sitting there, wearing a worn denim jacket and a look of quiet defiance, was Ethan, 28 now, taller, broader, but with the same protective stance he'd had the night Malcolm first saw him, under that liquor store sign. "Malcolm," Ethan said, leaning toward the glass. "I know you didn't do this." Malcolm swallowed. "Doesn't matter what you know, son. Matters what they can prove." That's why I stem here," Ethan replied. He slid a manila envelope across the counter to the guard. "This is for his lawyer." Inside were photographs, grainy, time-stamped images from a gas station camera across town. They showed Malcolm at the pump, 15 minutes before the assault supposedly happened. Not a full alibi, but enough to punch a hole in the timeline the prosecution was building. Ethan's voice softened. "I've been talking to Caleb. We still not gonna let them bury you. You took us in when nobody else would. We still gonna do the same for you." It wasn't just the words, it was the look in Ethan's eyes. Not pity, not fear, but resolve. The same kind Malcolm had once carried for 2 boys who had nothing. Here's what that moment teaches us. Hope isn't always roar back into your life. Sometimes it walks in quietly, sits down across from you, and reminds you that you're not alone. That visit lit something in Malcolm, not just the will to fight but the clarity to fight smart. He'd been playing defense, waiting for the system to prove him guilty. Now he would go on offense, dismantling their case piece by piece. And he had allies, unexpected ones. Because Ethan and Caleb weren't just here to visit, they were here to investigate. The first rule of fighting a system that's already decided your fate: don't announce you're fighting. Malcolm knew that, so while the prosecution thought he was sitting in his cell, waiting to be swallowed whole, he was already moving, quietly, precisely. Inside he watched. Every inmate who came through had stories, most exaggerated, some true, all valuable if you knew how to filter them. It didn't take long before he overheard the name Ray Danner in the day room. Not from a cop. From a man in orange who claimed Danner had gotten into a bar fight over gambling debt, the same night Malcolm was accused of assaulting him. Malcolm didn't push, didn't ask questions right away. You can't harvest trust by kicking down doors. You water it slowly. A shared meal. A helping hand with a letter home. Eventually the man offered more, the name of the person Danner was actually fighting with. On the outside, Ethan and Caleb were working their own angles. Ethan leaned on a contact from his construction job, a man who sometimes drank at the very bar where the assault happened. Caleb tracked down the security camera facing the alley, the same alley where prosecutors claimed Malcolm was seen fleeing. The footage was murky, but the figure in the grainy video was wearing a light-colored hoodie. Malcolm, at the time, had been in his work shirt, dark navy, grease-stained, a small detail, but in court, small cracks can break a wall. None of this made headlines. No one was shouting victory. This was a silent climb. Slow, deliberate, and unnoticed by the people who thought they'd already won. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Strategy isn't about a single grand move. It's about building so many small advantages that by the time the other side realizes what's happening, their position is already collapsing. By the end of the month, Malcolm's lawyer had an entirely different file than the one the DA expected. A file that didn't just defend Malcolm, it began to point the finger elsewhere. But even the best laid plans need a moment to go public. And when Malcolm's case finally reached that point, it wasn't a quiet reversal, it was a complete flipping of the table. The courtroom smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish, the scent of 100 verdicts already written before the trial even began. Malcolm sat at the defense table, wrists free for the first time in months, but still bound by the weight of what could happen next: life without parole, a slow death behind bars. The prosecution opened with confidence. Detective Briggs himself took the stand, describing how he personally linked Malcolm to the scene of the assault. He pointed to the grainy alley footage, claimed the silhouette matched Malcolm's build, and leaned heavily on the testimony of the two so-called witnesses. When it was the defense's turn, Malcolm's lawyer, Miss Grant, didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She started with the timeline. "Detective Briggs," she said, "you testified the assault took place at approximately 9:15 p.m., correct?" Briggs nodded. She slid a photograph onto the projector. It showed Malcolm, time-stamped 9:02 p.m., pumping gas across town. "Would you agree," she continued, "that it would be difficult for my client to leave this location, travel across the city, commit the assault, and be seen fleeing within 13 minutes?" The room shifted, a low murmur, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Next came the hoodie. Caleb, dressed in a clean button-down, took the stand. He testified that Malcolm had been in his work shirt that evening, and the video clearly showed a light-colored hoodie. Then Miss Grant played the footage frame by frame. The jury leaned forward. The difference was obvious. Finally, the defense called an inmate, the same man Malcolm had quietly built trust with inside. He testified under oath that he'd overheard Ray Danner himself admitting the fight was over gambling debt, and that the man who actually hit him was a known enforcer for a local bookie. Piece by piece, the prosecution's case cracked. And then came the break. Ethan was the last witness. He didn't talk about timelines or clothing. He told the jury about the night Malcolm found him, and Caleb, how a man with nothing chose to give them everything. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned. "This is not a violent man," Ethan said. "This is the man who kept us alive, and we set here to keep him alive." When the verdict came, the air in the room was different, lighter. Not guilty wasn't just an acquittal. It was a rebuke to every assumption, every file note, every silent judgment that had been hanging over Malcolm since he was 12. That's what that moment teaches us. Sometimes the tables don't just turn, they flip, and when they do, everyone who was betting on your failure has to sit in the wreckage of their certainty. Freedom didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like stepping out into sunlight that was too bright, air that was too clean, and a world that had kept moving without you. When Malcolm walked out of the courthouse, Ethan and Caleb were there. No cameras, no crowd, just the two men who had once been boys under his roof. They hugged him the way soldiers hug after a battle. Neither thought they'd survive. But victories in the shadow of injustice are complicated. The shop where Malcolm had worked didn't offer his job back. Bad for business, they said, even with the acquittal. Neighbors who'd seen him led away in cuffs still crossed the street, rather than meet his eyes. The trial had cleared his name on paper, but paper doesn't erase memory. Still, there were ripples he couldn't ignore. The retired teacher, Mrs. Grant, stopped by his apartment with a pie and a letter from the school board, a new mentorship program for at-risk youth, inspired by the story of the man who took in two boys and raised them right. One of the jurors, a white man Malcolm had never met before, sent a handwritten note. "You changed the way I see things. I'm sorry it took so long." And then there was Detective Briggs. Internal Affairs opened an inquiry into his handling of witness testimony. Word around town was that his days in uniform were numbered. Here's what that moment teaches us. Redemption doesn't come in a single wave. It comes in drops. Some you see, some you don't. And while public vindication is rare, the quieter form, the shift in a single mind, the spark in a single life, can echo longer than headlines. Malcolm didn't celebrate with a big speech. He went home, sat at his kitchen table, and cooked dinner for Ethan and Caleb. The same way he had 20 years ago. Because for him, the win wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the fact that despite everything the system threw at them, the family they built was still standing. If you ask Malcolm Reese about that trial now, he won't call it his greatest fight. He'll tell you the real fight happened 20 years earlier, on a sidewalk under a flickering neon sign, when he saw two scared boys and had to decide whether to keep walking or stop. That choice, quiet, costly, and unseen, became the thread that pulled him back from the edge decades later. Not because he planned it. Not because he expected a return. But because, in his words, if you got a little light, you share it. You don't know who gonna need it later. Could be you. Here's what that moment teaches us. Legacy isn't about what you leave when you're gone. It's about what you plant while you're here. Seeds that might take years to grow. Roots that might save someone else's life, or your own. Malcolm still fixes cars. Ethan now runs his own construction crew. Caleb works with the youth mentorship program Mrs. Grant helped start. They don't call it paying it forward, they call it keeping the circle unbroken. And now, I'll turn this to you. Somewhere in your life, there sits a choice coming. It won't look heroic, it won't look convenient. But it will be the kind of choice that plants a seed, one that might change a life in ways you'll never see. When that moment comes, remember, Malcolm. Remember that a single act of integrity can outlast the lies, the suspicion, even the system itself. So here sits the challenge. Live in such a way that if the world ever turns on you, the people you have touched will stand up and say, "Not on my watch." If this story resonated with your values, like, comment, and subscribe. Not for the algorithm, for the conversation, the one that starts here, but has the power to echo far beyond this screen.